author Dr. Arturs Kalnins from the article, The VIF Score, What Is It Good For? Absolutely Nothing, published in the January 2025 issue of the Organizational Research Methods Journal. Dr. Kalnins, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So for our interview today, we'll talk about the background story of the paper, such as the author's motivation and review process, as well as their further thoughts on how to take this research forward. So first, to start us off, can you give us a brief highlight of the article and how this article might help scholars in their research?
Sure. So this article concerns what the variance inflation factor score, or what's commonly known as a VIF score. And this is used by scholars throughout the social sciences, even in the hard sciences as well, to dismiss concerns about multicollinearity within the context of ordinary least squares regression. And this has become the dominant diagnostic to again dismiss concerns regarding multicollinearity. And it's become so dominant, in fact, that I have looked for the last few years. About 35,000 papers appear to be referencing it every year within the context of multicollinearity. That was based on Google Scholar searches. So it's really used very widely throughout the social sciences. But I noticed that it really didn't have the logical basis that people seem to think it does. And I thought it would be worth doing a paper that delved into that. So what people usually do is they will say that I've now run a regression. I have two variables. They might be moderately to highly correlated, 0.4, 0.5, 0.7. And now I'm getting statistical significance for at least one of my variables. Say one of the variables is hypothesized. The other one might be a control variable. So for the hypothesized variable, yeah, I'm getting the significance and I'm getting the direction that I want. But there's this other variable which is correlated with my hypothesized variable of interest. And that, again, may be a control or another hypothesized variable, but it's kind of correlated. And that might be demonstrating statistical significance, but moving in the opposite direction. So even if, this other variable should normally, say, have a positive effect, all of a sudden when I put it in together with my variable of interest, it has this negative effect now, and my variable has a positive effect. And so this is a situation I think many people have experienced, where we're wondering why two variables, when you put them both in a regression, the coefficients tend to kind of move off. One shoots up, one looks a little too big in the right direction, and the other one perhaps is in the completely wrong direction. And that is a result of the fact that the variables are correlated, plus some other factors, and that I can go into when we talk a little bit more. And so this is a concern to people. People have noticed that there's not something quite right about this, but then along comes the VIF score, and people say, as long as I calculate out this score, and say it's less than 5, or some people say less than 10, less than 4, I've even seen 1 or 2 say less than 20, then we can just somehow assume that multicollinearity is not a problem, and we can just proceed and assume all the results are fine. And that's kind of the norm that people do. And I started to really dig into this because I noticed how frequently people were referring to this. And I noticed that, there's not a lot of logical basis for that. Now, first of all, what the background of the VIF score is just going back, and if you look back to methods work from 30, 40 years ago, the whole idea of the VIF score, again, it's called the variance inflation factor, right? So it increases the variance, it inflates the variance of the independent variables when they are highly correlated. And the idea of wanting to keep it low is, well, if this VIF score is low, that means the variance is not going to be that out of hand. And what that actually means is that you're less likely to get type 2 errors. In other words, you're less likely to you're less likely to be in a situation where you're getting no statistical significance, but really the variable in reality does have a true effect. And so if anything, the kind of the VIF score, the more I kind of studied it and looked how it had been used historically, if anything, the value might be to say that, say we have a certain sample size and we're really confident in a hypothesis about our variable, and yet the variable is not exhibiting significance. And what you could use the VIF score for, hypothetically, is to say, okay, well, it looks like the VIF score is very high, so because it's correlated with another variable that's in the regression, and therefore, you're not seeing significance. And that might be a legitimate approach to, or a legitimate basis for using the VIF score. The problem is that nobody uses it for that. So instead, somehow that got turned into using VIF score to or buttress or justify your statistically significant effect. So you say, well, I have a variable, it's a hypothesis is supported, statistical significance is there, and there's this pesky other variable kind of going in the opposite direction that's highly correlated, but we're going to ignore that, and we're just going to say, well, the VIF score is under 10, so that's none of this is a problem. And so there's just no basis for this. There's no basis to use the VIF score to be able to say that because the VIF score is low, therefore somehow the statistical significance that we've achieved is better than if it would have been achieved otherwise. So there's really no basis for saying that. And yet that's how people do it. That's how, and I'll give any viewers of this video a challenge, is to say, because I've done this several times, just go to Google Scholar and Google VIF score and say whatever your favorite relevant journals are, say, organizational journals, whatever. So Google VIF or variance inflation factor and be sure to get the right journals. Pull 50 articles like that and take an hour and just quickly access each of those articles and look at what they're doing with the VIF score. And I will guarantee you, because I've done this several times, I will guarantee you that 49 out of 50 are saying we got statistically significant results, and therefore we can ignore the multicollinearity because the VIF score is below 10 or below 5 or whatever it is. That's what everybody's using it for. And again, there's just no basis for using this in this fashion at all. So in the paper, the paper is just basically an exposition of why this doesn't really make any sense. And the basic idea, we actually also, the reviewers kind of had us push a little on just more basic methodological theory. And so I was very pleased to come up with a methodological example of a case where, say, you have two proxy variables and they're both correlated, but they're both proxying for a variable that we know is omitted. And in that kind of case, the two proxy variables are going to be highly correlated because, again, they're correlated with this omitted variable, but neither of them is the omitted variable, right? So they're just proxies. And what you see is what I demonstrate in this paper, and was able to demonstrate that in that case, just the fact that the proxies are correlated, even if neither of them has their own effect, it's only their effect works only through the effect from an omitted variable, you will see that the coefficients move off in opposite directions. One of them ends up being positive, one ends up being negative. Even if the true effect, again, the true correlations through the omitted variable are both positive and might be very similar, but yet you see these coefficients in a regression that includes both of these proxy variables going off into opposite directions. And one of those results might be reasonable as a proxy variable, but the other one, which has the opposite direction, is just nonsense, right? That is just strictly a false artifact of this kind of usage of having either an omitted variable, or I talk about a common factor in another paper. And what I demonstrate is you can have, in this situation, you can have ridiculously low VIF scores. So again, we say, oh, the VIF score should be lower than 5, and then there's no problem. Well, I'm able to show that, and just this is all analytically. I do it all through just through the mathematics that of ordinary least squares regression. It's not that hard to calculate out analytically exactly what kind of results you'll get using OLS. And what I find is you can have VIF scores that are less than 2, and easily these kind of situations you can have results that are clearly false positives. So they're actually type 1 errors. They're not type 2 errors. So all the practice to date that, and again, this is kind of it's a myth, but it's the standard practice is to do these VIF scores. So I'm not criticizing people for doing them or for using them. They're just kind of doing what everybody else is doing and says it works.
Mm-hmm.
They're not methodologists, and that's fine. But it's just there's no basis to use a VIF score to say that my statistically significant results are not being influenced by multicollinearity. There just is no basis for that. So that's what the paper is involved in. It just kind of works through a lot of these examples using some pretty straightforward mathematical analysis. No simulation. This is all direct analysis straight from the premises of ordinary least squares regression. And nonetheless, you can verify all these results with simulation if you want. Just to say, hey, let's stop doing this. It makes no sense to do. It makes no sense to report these VIF scores as being supportive of your statistically significant results. There's no logic for it. Let's stop, and let's deal with the fact that this is really kind of a difficult situation for the empirical researcher to be in, to have variables. Maybe they're interested in, again, in terms of hypothesizing, they're interested in one variable, maybe in both. But if you have two highly correlated variables, there's really not a lot you can do to kind of definitively convince anybody that those results are going to be both legitimate. And particularly, so my conclusions from this are to caution people to say, look, if you have results of correlated variables and one of them is going off in the wrong direction, and that result should really be positive, and yet your regression is reporting it as being negative, and then let's not also assume that the other variable that maybe is exhibiting a positive effect and you hypothesize positive, let's not assume that effect is anywhere close to the same magnitude that you're getting, because the fact that second correlated variable is in there is actually potentially pushing the coefficient of the variable you're interested in to end up and inflating it to end up being much larger than it would be otherwise. All right, so those are the kind of cautions and that I like to tell people that let's not just use a quick diagnostic and say, oh, everything's fine because we've done this VIF score and the variance inflation factor score. Let's not do that. Let's really think about what we're trying to do and does it make sense? And it particularly it's particularly a concern in issues where maybe you don't even have such strong theory. Maybe you say, oh, gee, this variable, we thought it was going to be positive, but now it's negative. So it's time to do some new theorizing because it's such a surprising, interesting result that we got a negative effect on the one variable. Well, that might just be a collinearity effect. That might be a false artifact, right? A false positive. So don't think that you found something really interesting and counterintuitive because one of your correlated variables has the opposite sign than what people might expect it to have. It's likely just, again, an artificial artifact of this multicollinearity. So I say let's really be careful and let's not be overly tricky in our theorizing, and let's not, I think our field sometimes has a desire to find all kind of counterintuitive results. Let's not feel we need to be counterintuitive because all you might be ending up with is a false positive in the hopes of finding something that's counterintuitive. And also, cases where you say, well, the variable could go either way, the effect could go either way, so let's just look at this empirically. This too, in the case where you have variables that are pretty highly correlated, let's not do that because just as a straight empirical analysis could just be giving you a false positive on one of those variables. So let's not just say, oh, we're just testing, we're just doing a horse race, and we just want to see which way the variable goes, and we'll assume that that represents some kind of reality, because it doesn't. So just if you do have variables that are highly correlated, let's be careful. Let's worry about these variables going off into to opposite directions. Don't use something like a VIF score. And there's a little somewhat more complex test that people do called the condition index that has the same kind of problems. Let's not do these tests and just think everything's great because we've done them. Let's try to actually look at, what happens. One thing I recommend too, why don't you take out one of the variables and then put it back in? I'm not saying just omit the variable permanently. I'm saying let's look at it. Let's look at your hypothesized variable both with and without the other variable in the regression. If the variable is very stable and very consistent, that's some pretty good evidence that that variable is actually, a meaningful, or that result variable has a meaningful result. Yeah, so that's it. Probably went a little bit over your time, but that's overall, that's kind of the motivation for the paper, and why my co-author and I did it. And yeah, I mean, we're really happy with the way it came out, and the whole review process at ORM was great. We had some really dedicated reviewers who I think understood the problem and really helped guide the work forward.
Yes, thank you for really highlighting the
Yeah.
importance of not just using the quick statistical diagnostic, but actually understanding what is happening, and also the issues around the VIF score. So now that we are in the, you mentioned the review process and how the reviewers were really dedicated and amazing in the review process. Is there any interesting stories in the review process that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, I'm not sure there would be so much kind of an interesting story, but I will say I will say that the paper was improved tremendously throughout the review process. And whereas basically we first sent the first version we sent was largely just had some much simpler, I wouldn't call it kind of rigorous mathematical analysis. I would say we just had some examples in it that showed how the VIF score can go wrong, and how it can lead us to the wrong conclusions. And the reviewers kind of both of them said, well, this is fine, but for ORM we like to have a little bit of a deeper contribution for a full paper, and think about what you could really contribute to really very basic methodological theory. And so I had done some previous work that had appeared in Strategic Management Journal, where I had looked at things, I'd looked what I called the common factor, that also how that can make these variables sail off into opposite directions, even when both effects of the variables are really positive. And so I did find that I could go above and beyond that, and so my co-author and I developed this example of, or this case of having an omitted variable and two proxies for that omitted variable, and they're correlated, and again that's an interesting little bit of methodological theory as well, that you'll get this, again, you'll get these results sailing off into opposite directions in situations like this, when you have an omitted variable and two variables are correlated with it. Again, the common factor, the only time when multicollinearity doesn't really have any of these effects is when this regression is perfectly specified, what the econometricians call the classical linear regression model, when all the variables that are supposed to be in the regression are, right? So as though we ever have that situation, right, where we know every single variable that's supposed to be in a regression, and we can measure them without error, right? So that's there too. And once you do that, all those things are true, then yeah, the multicollinearity doesn't matter. That's true. And then it goes back to only being that issue of the type 2 error that I talked about in the beginning. But as soon as you have anything like measurement error, like just some unobservable factor that's playing a role, that you have an omitted variable, any of these things combined with variables that are highly correlated in some way can immediately lead to these false positive results. And so it was really nice to, I think through that review process to I think it was really nice to develop some of that. So I think there's a body of knowledge around this idea of what multicollinearity can do when regressions are imperfectly specified, and that came through the review process. So I think there's some basic methodological contributions there now that were not in that original version of the paper that we sent. But we're really happy they gave us the opportunity with revise and resubmit to do it, and I think it went through maybe even three rounds, or I think 2 full rounds. Maybe the third round it didn't go back to reviewers, but. Again, yeah, it was a very positive process, and again, by very kind of dedicated people who again, I think they were convinced of the need for something like this, because I think they too were frustrated by the amount that the VIF score gets overused.
Yes, and now that we are on the topic of how the reviewer also agree with you that there are issues with how VIF score is being used, and also diagnostic of multicollinearity and the issues relevant, what are your evaluation of the current state of research around multicollinearity in research, or revisiting statistical rule of thumbs or model specification?
Well, yeah, I mean. It's interesting. So I think my work, and with this paper with Kendall, Praitis, Hill, other work that I've done on my own, I've largely pushed this idea of kind of that multicollinearity is a worse problem than people think. I still think that idea has achieved some traction, and I'm happy with that. But still, a lot of people, it still has quite a ways to go. So I think we have our work to do. To get people to take this problem a little more seriously. As I said, 35,000 papers a year kind of refer to the VIF statistic, and like I said at the beginning, just do a test, take an hour and take a look at 50 papers that have cited the VIF statistic in your favorite journal or whatever it is, and you'll see that everybody's still kind of doing it the same way. And we kind of want to put the brakes on that and just get people to, again, there's really, at this point, there's nothing more we can say other than let's really try to understand, what's going on in our regression. Let's present multiple specifications. Let's not just, like I said, there's no problem with taking out one of these variables for one regression, presenting it, then put the variable in, present that, discuss how if you have this correlated control variable taken out, put back in, you can then see, well, how does that change the variable, the hypothesized variable? Things like this, I think, are just really understanding your specific, data and your regression, and just really trying to address this on a case-by-case basis, just in a way that reviewers will understand, your readers will understand. I think that's what's going to be really important. I don't think there are going to be any future quick fixes. I don't think I'm going to come out with with a different score, and all of a sudden that's going to solve these problems and everybody can just cite it and move on. I think it's just kind of a fundamental issue of using ordinary least squares, or even any of the maximum likelihood methods that we use, anything from simple kind of logits and probits and all the way to say SEM as well. I mean, these problems exist, and interestingly, I've done a lot of with SEM, and as soon as you have maximum likelihood, you can no longer do things in a in a nice, clean mathematical, yes, analytical way. You just have to resort to simulation, because maximum likelihood is a big black box, basically. And so you kind of use that. But even things like SEM, you'll have these same problems if you have kind of correlations across latent constructs that may or may not be, say, driven by similarity indicators or something. You have a lot of these same kind of problems can arise. One interesting thing I found in that case, in the case for SEM, is one thing that almost saves you a lot of the time is the fact that as soon as you have these kind of multicollinearity problems, the SEM models often don't converge, right? And then so you're saved, just because in OLS, it doesn't matter how crazy your model is, you'll get these results, and they may or may not be reflect actual reality. As I said, they may be simply false artifacts, but in SEM, often when you have these models that are misspecified, they just don't converge, and then at least you're not publishing them. So that's a benefit, I suppose. But yeah, it works. So again, I think there's nothing we can really do other than to say, really know your data, present multiple specifications, even present a lot of descriptive statistics. Everybody should be presenting full correlation tables, bivariate correlation tables. Everybody should be doing that. We should be presenting bivariate correlations of your squared terms and your interactions and everything else. I never understood why people don't do that, because a paper I did in ORM about a year ago kind of shows also about how some of the multicollinearity problems can affect quadratic variables and interaction terms as well. So I talk a little bit about that in that other paper, but the basic idea is just present the reviewers and the readers with a lot of information about what your data looks like. And by the way, at least in kind of organizational sciences, it seems like a given most people will present bivariate correlations. There are other fields like medicine, they don't, economics, they don't. And then you have real hard time trying to figure out, well, if we don't even know what's correlated with what, how do we interpret these variables? I look at things, I would like to in the future, also do some work in medicine and epidemiology, because I think there's a real need for this. I found this paper in the New York Times, loves to write about latest medical research. And so they have this paper about how good for you coffee is. And they say coffee, like even drinking more than 4 cups a day, like every extra cup you drink has additional benefits for longevity and overall health. But what I found out by digging around, and they didn't have a bivariate correlation, but I was able to piece together that coffee drinking is quite highly correlated with cigarette smoking. And and it's the same kind of thing with one variable being very positive, and so the cigarette smoking obviously is going to have a very real, very negative effect on health. And while anything that's hugely correlated with that can potentially therefore have this false artificial positive effect, and I'm convinced that's what was going on there, but they didn't really provide enough information to me to make a definitive conclusion or write a comment into the journal or anything like that. So although it's still on my wish list of things to do at some point. But so I think this is a very broad-based problem, an issue that dealing with multicollinearity and with the VIF score being used, it's across a lot of disciplines, and so I think there's a lot of potential for future work also across the disciplines, and that might involve also trying to get involved with methodologists from the other disciplines, or maybe just even trying to get on my own, trying to see if I can get something published in either a medical methods journal or other things, because again, these issues are pervasive throughout not only in the social sciences but even these medical sciences and others.
Thank you for talk about how the issue is not just in organizational science, but also other field of research and science as well. And you mentioned that one of the main future directions will be cross-discipline research on multicollinearity and how to diagnose the issues and how to gain more understanding of our own data before making conclusions. Are there other potential future research directions in multicollinearity that you want to discuss, or topics relevant to revisiting statistical rule of thumb diagnostic?
Yeah, so in general, I think so. Regarding rule of thumb diagnostics, I think kind of what we're finding is in general they're not very convincing, and it's not only I would generally discourage the use of any diagnostic, whatever it is, just saying, oh, above a certain value or below a certain value. A lot of them are just flawed, right? I mean, for example, and also in regression analysis, we have kind of the Hausman test and trying to determine whether fixed effects or random effects should be used. A lot of diagnostics have a variety of problems because these rules of thumb are arbitrary. Something like the Hausman test, you can actually just get, if you require that Often it's that if the test is, in the case where there's actually statistical significance associated with a test, like the Hausman test, that sometimes the statistical significance is bad, and then people say, oh, well, we don't have a problem because our Hausman test is insignificant. Well, also the insignificance can just come from low power, right? So you never can distinguish low power from the fact that you've avoided a real problem that could be in your data. And so that's something, so I in general, I don't trust these tests very much, regardless, some might have more logic. The VIF test is just particularly a poor test because it's just even fundamentally misplaced. This idea that you can somehow verify the statistical significance of your findings based on a low VIF score is just meaningless. And yet, again, it's taken root as the standard thing people do, but it's just meaningless. So I think, yeah, so that's in general, I don't like these kind of tests. I don't trust them. But obviously we'd have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. I think there's other interesting, settings where this is potentially an issue. I'm also, right now I'm taking a look at issues of measurement error in more detail, so that might lead to some future interesting work. I'm looking at things like hierarchical regression has some interesting aspects to it, where the kind of multicollinearity can get transferred from level to level. You have kind of fixed effects, panel data regressions. There's some additional interesting things. So these are things that over the next few years, I might have time to, or I hope to have time to kind of develop, whether on my own or maybe with some co-authors.
And following that thoughts, do you have any advice for scholars who are interested in studying the topic of multicollinearity, providing recommendations for model specifications, or revisiting like statistical rule of thumb? Do you have any advice
Yeah,
for
well, I think
scholars?
the practical advice, I'll just repeat what I said before, but I think that, because I do think this is really that important, which is just, you know, when you're theorizing, understand your data. And if you're going to have highly collinear variables, or even what we call moderately collinear, right? I'm really showing that even correlation, by the way, I didn't mention this before, I'm really showing in a lot of my work that correlations of 0.3 and 0.4 can be quite dangerous, right? Most people think those as completely benign, right? And so even 0.3, 0.4 is a problem. But if your data is all like that, don't set out on the goal of kind of hypothesizing all these really interesting distinctions for how all these variables are going to have these very different and interesting and distinct effects, because even if you get these effects going in opposite directions, again, this may not signify anything real. This might just be kind of a false positive that comes about, when using OLS with these kind of data. So I think that's really, as a practical sense, for somebody who wants to study multicollinearity, or I would say more broadly related methods issues. I think one thing I have done in this paper, this ORM paper, and the SMJ paper from 2018 is, and there are a handful of others like Seamson et al. in 2010 and ORM as well, to really try to use analytical mathematics. Let's try to move beyond just simulation, and particularly if you're studying OLS, it's not that hard to set up all the equations, kind of go in with an assumption that our data is, say, normally distributed, but it has some correlations, or you can try different distributions. This is a valid path forward, I think, and it relative to simulations, it gives you a lot better understanding of exactly what the mechanisms are in terms of what's going wrong. So I would recommend, like I said, take a look at this paper, the paper that I'm being interviewed about here, this now coming out in the first issue 2025. Take a look at what we did. It's not that complicated, right? I mean, you do need some knowledge of linear algebra. You do need a pretty good understanding of basic probability and probability distributions. But it's not something that you have to be some kind of econometric super genius to be able to understand. You don't. I mean, and so I'd really recommend more people try to look at this as an alternative, or even as a complement to to simulations. And I'll give you a secret also, like all my results, I simulate them to death just also to make sure I'm doing the math right. And it's a really a satisfying thing to see that I developed something completely mathematically. Now I go over and I do simulations and I'm getting exactly the results that I derived, was able to derive mathematically. So I use simulations all the time, but I use them more of a check on my mathematical work, because occasionally, you just make some little mistake somewhere and you're like, no, the simulation isn't quite showing what I wrote. And then I know to go back and to do the mathematics a little differently, or that I just have to go back and find what the mistake is. So that's something I'd really like to encourage like kind of like ORM authors to do, is to consider the uses, particularly for OLS. As soon as, like I mentioned before, as soon as you're doing maximum likelihood, then forget it. There's really not a lot we can do other than to try to simulate things as much as we can.
Yes, and thank you very much for the advice of not using the core mathematical
Yeah.
analytics besides the tool of simulation, was a very powerful tool. Um, from beside what we have covered so far in the interview, is there any other things that you want to share with the audience?
No, well, I'd say read my paper, right? I mean, read my paper with Kendall, Praitis Hill, 2025, first issue. This issue comes up. Take this issue seriously. I mean, it's when you have correlated variables, like, stuff can happen. That's not exactly what you want. And I know we're all in this field, like, to discover truth, and so let's take these things seriously to make sure that we don't end up thinking that just some sort of mathematical artifacts of correlation and regressions is actually truth, because it's often not. And also I think we need to let's show a little bit of humility in terms of what statistical analysis can actually show us, right? I mean, um, the more sophisticated we make our equations and put in, not only quadratic terms, but even like cubic terms and this and that, it's increasingly hard to really sometimes distinguish between real results and false positives. So let's show a little humility. Let's try to go back and theorize at as basic level as we can. Let's not try to shoot for having counterintuitive results. Let's stick with the most basic science that we can, and that will hopefully also lead to a lot of good replication and just moving the science of our field forward.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kalnins, and your co-author for your work in bringing the issues of VIF score and also the multicollinearity diagnostic to the front through your article, and really appreciate your time sharing with us today.
Oh, I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you.